Well, this is terrific. I'm Steve Ehrman, the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. I'd like to welcome you all to the second annual Teaching Day. It's an occasion not to be the only day of the year when we think about teaching, but to reflect on some ideas. And it gives me a chance to put out a little public service announcement to say that we do try to support teaching in a variety of ways out of the Office of Teaching and Learning, and especially out of our new Teaching and Learning Collaborative. I thought the best way to do that would be to lecture, but using the time-honored manner of teaching more by talking faster. So I'm going to go down a list real fast, and my hope is that you'll notice the one item in the list where you think, oh, that would be something I could do. And then it doesn't matter whether you didn't hear the others. So, for example, we're making grants available to faculty who want to improve curricula so that they better prepare undergraduates to engage in undergraduate research. We're doing events like this one. There are instructional designers who are working with faculty on developing innovative courses, especially for the summer. The Teaching and Learning Collaborative is providing funding and support for departments that want to develop graduate programs, master's programs and certificate programs that are hybrids, which are a mix not only of face-to-face and online, but also on campus and off campus in ways that we hope can make something that will really make the world sit up and take notice of your field. We've been providing a little travel support sometimes when faculty want to go to educational conferences in their discipline to improve teaching for themselves and their colleagues. We've been working hard on the issue of rewards for teaching to try to make it, for there to be, in a literal and figurative sense, more of a payoff when one invests effort in improving teaching. We're establishing a GW Academy for distinguished teachers, the charter members of which will be all the past winners of Bender and Trachtenberg Awards. And Professor Derek Malone-France has agreed to chair that in its inaugural year and help it to get organized. We have this year, for the fourth year in a row, a faculty learning community for junior faculty to help prepare them to do teaching. And if you have colleagues who might be interested in that, I hope you'll urge them to apply. And by the way, with regard to the Academy, almost forgot to say, the guidelines for teaching awards for both faculty and graduate students will be coming out shortly. We hope you'll nominate deserving colleagues for that. At the graduate student level, in addition to the normal graduate TA preparation, which we're hoping to upgrade over the coming years, this year we're piloting a program for future faculty, for graduate students who want to begin preparing themselves for teaching as a faculty member in the future and have some certification for having done that. Our summer session is providing a ground for innovative approaches to organizing educational programs that can be tested out in the summer. Academic Technologies has been working to spread the word about Colonial Cast, which has been around for a while, but I think many of you may not know just how successful it's been. We did a study last year and discovered that about a quarter of the students in classes that take it find it vital for their academic success, and believed that if there were no such recordings, they would, their grades would suffer in the class. We also discovered that the faculty who use Colonial Cast, almost without exception, believe it has no impact on attendance, and the faculty who don't use Colonial Cast seem to often believe that it will have an impact on attendance, and that's why they don't use it. So that's the end of my speaking quickly in order to teach more. I'll just conclude that list by saying, what do you need? We've started a Teaching and Learning Collaborative. We have the Office of Teaching and Learning. If there's something you need, contact the TLC. They're kind of a switchboard, so if they can't provide it, they may know someone else who can. We have on the order of 60 staff and faculty spread across this institution who have a full-time or part-time responsibility for, in one way or another, supporting teaching, a collective budget probably upwards of $2 million or more for that, and we're trying to exercise that even more. So if the TLC can't provide the help, it's very likely that they can tell you who can, and if there isn't anybody who can, we'll get to work and try to create the help that you need. So we had the first annual Teaching Day last year. In the afternoon, Josipa Roxa, many of you may remember, made the case that there are real problems in undergraduate education particularly, and that what students are learning about critical thinking, for example, may not be as much as they did a few decades ago. In the morning, Nobel laureate Carl Wyman suggested that one way to get around that was to recognize that if you changed your methods, students could learn a lot more. And I hear that time and again, that improving learning is not necessarily an issue of trying harder to do what you've been doing all along, but to try something different. And the good news is sometimes that doesn't involve more time than you've been spending before. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about the environment for teaching excellence at research universities. Our morning keynote speaker will be talking particularly about that topic. In the afternoon, Ken Bain, who's here, will be running a session in this room about the techniques, the strategies that can be used for excellent teaching and learning. And at the same time, we're going to be having a forum of department chairs who will also be talking about the environment for excellence in teaching and how that relates to the faculty career. So just a couple of announcements before we get started. One is that this is being videoed, which means if you have colleagues who missed it, that video will be posted probably middle of next week, and there'll also be a video of the session this afternoon. And I can mention that confidently because, as I say, we already know the research is that if the video is available, people come anyway. So I'm not concerned about that. And remember, if you've registered for the whole day, there is lunch after this, and there will be, for everybody, a faculty social starting at 3:30. So we're off to a good start, I think, over the last year since we established the Office of Teaching and Learning. The provost has been supportive of this all the way, and I'd like to welcome Steve Lerman to the lectern to make some opening remarks for Teaching Day.
Well, first of all, thank you, Steve. Teaching Day, and maybe even more importantly, in fact, definitely more importantly, the list of things that are happening in the Office of Teaching and Learning was really what I had hoped would get going when we created the office in the first place. One of the things I wanted to emphasize as GW continues its evolution to be a more research-intensive university is not to have that conceptualized as a move away from great teaching. And I have long believed managed correctly, teaching and research, in fact, can be complements, not substitutes. But we need to think consciously about that. We need to make sure the resources are available to enable great teaching as well as to enable great research. And so his office, which I was created fairly early on when I arrived here, is really meant to bring together those resources, and we've actually added resources, to support the creation of high-quality educational experiences for all our students. I thought I'd just reflect on two of my own teaching experiences. I thought of that as a way to sort of give a sense why I think these sorts of things are important and why I think we can, by careful reflection, improve the quality of education for our students. I used to teach a very large undergraduate course. I probably taught it about 20 times. There was an introduction to computational methods, and this was my former institution, MIT. I used to teach it to students from virtually every major except computer science. And once in a while, we'd even have a computer science. It was really a course intended for those students who wanted to learn about computation and computational methods, but were not going to be computer science majors. They came from engineering, science, business, economics, and other fields. And for many years, I taught it in what I would characterize as a very traditional format. We lectured 3 hours a week. Students went with graduate teaching assistants into 1-hour recitation sections. We did 3 quizzes a year, and we did a final. And I think one of the observations, as many people who teach large lecture courses, is twofold. First of all, we covered a tremendous amount of material in the course. Second, the correlation between what people knew when they left the course and what we actually thought we taught in the course was pretty limited. That, in particular, teaching more rarely produced more learning. We had reached a point where we had jammed so much into the course that most students couldn't learn at all. And in fact, at some point, we not only reached diminishing returns, at least we came to believe that we got negative returns. Every time we added more things into the course, the net student learning probably went down in totality. And third of all, the modality of teaching, that lecture recitation, wasn't particularly well suited to the material. And so we undertook a complete transformation of the course to move it to what many people now call studio style or hybrid style. And so what we did was we structured each course session of what had previously been pretty much a straight up lecture in a large hall to a series of short expository descriptions, usually by me or my co-teacher, followed by an in-class computer-based exercise that we devised over time. And then that was followed in each of these by a reflection period. What happened when you tried to do this? How did it go? What were the mistakes? And during the time students would be doing the computer-based exercise, the teaching assistants and me and my co-teacher would run around the classroom and sort of watch over people's shoulders and basically give little hints and advice. And when we made this transformation, we actually had to change the structure of the hours of the course. We found it necessary to move to 3 1.5-hour class sessions rather than 3 1-hour sessions. We reduced the scope of the content back to a level we thought could be effectively learned, not taught, but learned in the time period we had. And we brought in someone to do an outside assessment of learning outcomes. And so I thought I'd tell you a little about each of those. First of all, what's interesting is students don't always embrace these things initially. And this has been the experience of many people who have tried these transformations. I'm not alone in this. It's interesting, students actually tend to be rather conservative about how they learn. And they often don't have a great conceptualization of how much they're actually learning as opposed to how much they're being taught. And so one of the lessons was you often have to deal with an initial period of some resistance from the students when you make changes like this. And you can partly offset that by talking to them, but some of it is to at some point you have to have the confidence to say, I really think this is a good idea, this is what we're going to do, and students may or may not always come along wholesale into that and buy into it. The second barrier, of course, is it increases the value of being physically in the class because there's these exercises and interactions that go on. I think it was Woody Allen who said 80 or 90% of success is showing up. Our students don't always show up. And of course, this made learning in the classroom an important activity as opposed to a relatively unimportant one for some students. The third has to do with assessment. First of all, my experience is it's very hard to do self-assessment for 2 reasons. First of all, the most obvious one is you have a stake in the outcome. And everyone understands assessment done by people who have an important stake in the outcome often introduces, even the best people introduce unconscious biases. The more important reason for me, frankly, was it's exhausting. Teaching in a new mode like this is itself tiring. Building all these exercises is tiring. Even had we had the ability to do an unbiased assessment, my co-teacher and I literally didn't have the time to do it as we were doing this educational transformation. And we got a tremendous amount out of it. We chose a style of assessment which is what I would call formative. That is, every week we would meet with the person doing the assessment and ask her, and she actually was a postdoc from Israel. She came to MIT, she stayed in my lab. We would ask her, what did we learn this week about how people learned? And so we would use it not in a summative form, although she ultimately did write a report and we wrote papers off of it, but much more in a how can we use these assessments as a form of a way to correct what we're doing as we felt our way through this new style of pedagogy. So bottom line, it is hard work. I think anyone who thinks it isn't hard work is mistaken. We were very lucky to get support financially for the innovation from Microsoft in this case, had a grant to MIT. MIT then could use that grant to offset some of the costs we had about bringing in outside assessors. We got extra teaching assistant. It really did help in this large course transformation to do that. And then third, you got to be willing to iterate. We did not get it right the first semester. Some things went incredibly well. Some things just didn't work for the students or for us. And so I would say it's a multi-year process. You can't make these sort of transformations right unless you're just either extraordinarily smart or extraordinarily lucky in all one change. But I would say in the end, the student learning outcomes were measurably better. And that really is what it's about. We call this teaching day, but really teaching day is actually a means to an end. The end, of course, is our students actually learn something. And we could measure distinctly improved learning outcomes from these changes. And that was ultimately the reward that we were looking for. Second personal experience, and I'll get off the stage, has to do with what really is teaching about. And the teaching and innovation I described earlier was really what most people conceptualize classically about, what is teaching. I used to lecture, I now do something different, but I'm sort of at the front of the room in some way, shape, or form, or I'm wandering around a classroom. The other form of teaching we all do, though, is what many people think of more as mentoring. And I'll talk briefly about my interest in encouraging here at GW more engagement with our students through research, and in particular undergraduate research experiences. When we engage with our students as colleagues in research, even as undergraduates, they become junior colleagues to us. I think it's a very different type of educational experience. I mean, first of all, in a classroom, the students sort of expect we actually know the answer. Right? So the enterprise in a classroom setting is, I'm trying to tell you or get you to learn something I already know, and there actually is an answer. There is something I know that I expect you to learn. When we engage in students in our research activities, we don't know the answer. I mean, if we knew the answer, it'd be dumb research in the first place. Why are you doing research? And so the student sees us and sees the activity quite differently. It is not the transmission of a canon of knowledge from one generation to another, it's rather the joint discovery of new knowledge. And that's a really exciting and very different sort of enterprise. So more pragmatically, moving from that sort of lofty statement, I've now put money on the table. I've begun to grow out more money into supporting undergraduate research of the type I just described. I found it as a student, when I go back to my own educational experience, perhaps the most exciting and important educational activity I did during my undergraduate years was be part of research with faculty members. It transformed my vision for what I wanted to do with my life. It was exciting. It was something that was so different from a classroom experience, and perhaps the most important part of my educational development, my development as a scholar. And I think as a faculty member, I always had undergraduates in my lab working on things, and I always found that to be the most profound way I really got to know students and their capabilities. That when you teach a large class, you sometimes get to know a few students well. You can certainly evaluate them. They did well in this class or not well in this class. But you don't really know what they can and can't do. And sometimes a student who really isn't doing well in a classroom turns out to be an extraordinarily good thinker and researcher. And sometimes the absolute top of the class student in your classroom turns out to be a terrible researcher. And I think many of us have had that experience, and I think it offers just a different way for students to excel that's very exciting. So I want to encourage all of you to think about the things that come out of today. This is something that I view, as Steve Ehrman said, Teaching Day is not about a day. It's about teaching and learning. And to the extent this influences how you want to now move forward with your own teaching and learning, that's really the whole point of the exercise. So welcome here. I'm looking forward to our guest lecturer, our guest speaker, and I will now turn to introducing him. So our speaker today is Dr. Lee Shulman. He's a professor emeritus at Stanford's School of Education. He's an educational psychologist by background and training, and he's known for his work on pedagogy at all levels of education, K-12 and higher ed. Among his many, many credentials is he served as the president of the National Academy of Education, a position that our own Dean Michael Foyer has just moved to. So Michael follows in a tremendously important tradition of great scholars. He was awarded, among many other things, the President's Medal of George Washington University. You're all scratching your head. You didn't know we gave a President's Medal. Yes, we do. It's one of our highest honors, bestowed by the president of the university on people who have made extraordinary contributions to their respective fields. And in 2002, he was elected as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And this morning, he's going to address us about teaching excellence in a research university, obviously a topic that is about as on point to this meeting as one can get. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Lee Shulman.
Thank you, Steve. One thing I've learned here at GW is if in doubt, just thank Steve, and usually you're right. It's so thoughtful to make it easier for a newcomer that way. Steve mentioned that he's an engineer. He didn't say what kind. I looked you up, Steve. You're, at least when you were doing honest faculty labor, you were an environmental and civil engineer, I believe. And your civility shows. And here we are talking about creating an environment for teaching. I hadn't thought to begin this way, but with an engineer present, I have to tell you a story about engineering. When I was president of the Carnegie Foundation, one of the many programs of research that we initiated was a program doing a comparative study of education in the professions. And we studied, therefore, over a period of 10 to 12 years, how people are educated for engineering, law, medicine. The Flexner Report was one of the very first accomplishments of the Carnegie Foundation 100 years ago, nursing, and the clergy. We studied the education of priests, ministers, and rabbis, as well as the education of school teachers. And one of my favorite experiences in doing this work, rest assured, I hired competent people to direct each of these programs of work who were insiders in the fields we were studying, but I usually try to join them for some of their site visits. And I joined the team that was visiting the School of Engineering at the University of Michigan. Michigan, as you may know, is a state around near the lake with the same name. In any event, after observing a quite extraordinary class, senior engineering class in design, it was a fascinating class. It began, students came into the class, 100 of them, finding two artifacts disassembled on a table in front of the room. What the two artifacts had in common is that they were both obsolete. One was a 12-year-old coffee maker. The other was a 6-month-old cell phone, which had already been obsolete for 3 months, of course. And the assignment for the day, the students were already in design groups that had been working together for the entire course. This was about the 10th week of the semester, was to choose one of those artifacts and then come up with an answer to the question, how might it have been designed otherwise? That's all. Some of the student problem-solving groups thought about the environmental impact of an obsolete coffee maker or cell phone, and how might its impact on the environment have been in some ways changed by designing it otherwise. Some were looking at affordability. This is something that every person ought to be able to have in their daily life. How could it be made more affordable? It was a fascinating, lovely example of the manner in which, in engineering, the concept of design as both an intellectual and a practical process is central to the work of the engineer. Afterwards, I met with a subgroup of those students in a kind of focus group, and I posed the following question to them. I said, let's imagine you found yourself sitting on a bus or a train next to somebody like my mother, who never saw a lengthy transportation experience as anything but an opportunity to talk to the stranger sitting next to her. You've been on such. My mother was about 4'10", but man, could she talk and listen. She loved to listen. And what if my mother had said to you, so what are you studying? And you said, that was the way my mother asked such questions. She came to this country at the age of 14 from Lithuania. And you said, I'm an engineer. And she said, oh, that's interesting. What's an engineer? How would you answer? And the students, I said, you can talk among yourselves until you come up with an answer you're all happy with. Steve, the answer this group of engineers gave me changed my life. They said an engineer is someone who uses math and the sciences to mess with the world. By designing and making things that people will buy and use. I thought they were done. They weren't done. And once you mess with the world, you're responsible for the mess you've made. That was their definition. It not only profoundly influenced the way I thought about the education of engineers, that study of educating engineers, which is now has been available for about 5 or 6 years now in a book called Educating Engineers, whose senior author, Sherry Shepard, is professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford and took a part-time leave to direct this study. But this notion that a professional, not just an engineer, is defined as someone who uses the content knowledge, the scientific and humanistic, the empirical and normative and interpretive knowledge that they have acquired painstakingly, not for its own sake necessarily, but to mess with the world. By doing something in and on and with the world, and that knowing and doing carries with it a deep responsibility for the mess you've made. They didn't say what so many people might say, and then we have to remember that we're going to be accountable to somebody for the mess we've made. You know, we got to make sure that we have clean books for the audit. It wasn't that. Or I got to make sure that I behave in a manner so that when I get evaluated, I'll have enough articles and enough good teaching. No, no. It wasn't we are accountable. We are actively responsible. That's part of the process of messing with the world. That's what they were telling me. And I was reminded of this story, Steve, by your lovely account of your teaching in computational methods and how you went about it. Because I think what Steve was reminding us about is that even though we academics, holders of the lofty degree Doctor of Philosophy or some equivalent thereof, don't think of ourselves usually as professionals. Those are people in business and medicine and engineering and those other less lofty occupations. We are professionals. We profess. We are professors. And the way I would like us to think about what we do as a profession is we use the knowledge of theory, of method, of practice, of text, whatever our field deals with as an arena of knowledge development, or the development aesthetically, if we are in the arts, we use it to mess with the world. And on teaching day, I would say we use it to mess with the minds and hearts of our students. By giving courses, by supervising undergraduate research, by being role models for history or biology or classics or psychology or whatever field we represent, or an interdisciplinary field like neuroscience, we embody that field for the students we teach. And so we are here to use that knowledge to mess with the minds and hearts of our students. And we are responsible for the mess we've made. And one of the things that Steve described, although, you know, it may not have sounded so revolutionary, but it is Steve described a teaching experience where he actually asked, I wonder if the students learned what I taught. And where he discovered, and I assume from some forms of assessment that you did before you hired the outside assessor, that the more we taught, the less they learned. That happens to be a frequently encountered algorithm in the economics of pedagogy, by the way. That often to increase teaching does not lead to an increase of learning. It has often in fact, in some of Carl Wyman's own research, not only leads to less learning, but also leads to a lower valuing of what it is you're teaching. Because it's very hard to end up loving something that you feel you're drowning in. I suspect that Jonah did not decide that sailing would be a good hobby. But how many of our students in some of our courses feel they've been swallowed into the body of a beast that is swimming off in its own direction without much concern for us? And so perhaps that should be seen as a kind of leitmotif for my remarks for the next piece of time, that we are members of a profession, that we are here to use what we understand and know and are still in the process of knowing. One of the beauties of being a professor is that our scholarship, let's face it, one of our dirty little secrets as professors is if we love to do research, and I certainly love to do research, we're not doing it first and foremost to publish it. We're doing it because when we do good research, it makes us feel smarter about the world. It helps us understand things better, understand them more deeply, or we do research that helps us realize that something we thought we understood for many years ain't so. That's wonderfully disruptive and enlightening research. And I have a confession to make. Well, no, it's not a confession. I spent 35 years as an academic, as a professor, before I became president of the Carnegie Foundation. And I spent not one day of any of those years as a department chair, as a dean, or as any kind of provost. So I speak to you about academia from the trenches. I confess, direct some research institutes, but all the faculty members in the institute held their tenure in another part of the university and came to work collaboratively in my research programs. And what I loved the most about the research and writing I was able to do is at the end of the day, I felt I understood things I hadn't understood before. And of course, I wanted to tell somebody else about it. It was one of the reasons I published, but it was also one of the reasons I taught, is because I wanted to share, to exchange. I wanted to mess with the minds and hearts of people who were both my peers and my students about the things that I had come to learn. And so that was, I hope, a kind of leitmotif, or can be, for what we discuss today. That's what we do professionally. Steve, you also mentioned that GW has an aspiration. Now, in terms of the Carnegie classifications of institutions of higher education, you are already a highly intensive research institution. But you want to get better. You want your scholarship to be better. You want to do more of it. You want to do it even better, which, of course, all of us as individual scholars would like too. I don't want to look back at my scholarly career and say, my God, I had my best ideas by the time I was 35, and after that it was coasting. You want to feel that you're getting smarter and doing better work as you mess with the world. And the anxiety, if you will, is that in order to do that, you're engaged in a zero-sum game. That George Washington University, recognized for many years as a first-rate institution for an undergraduate and graduate student to go to and learn. Whether you like it or not, you've got a very good reputation as a teaching institution. I have a grandson who's a senior in high school this year. Stevie's going to come visit in about a month or so. What's a grandfather for, right? And he's heard that GW is a superb teaching institution in one of the most exciting cities in the world, where interdisciplinary work is not frowned upon, because he's interested in both psychology and performing arts. Okay? It's my grandson. His parents raised him. I didn't. The question is it a zero-sum game? Can you be excellent at both? That's what I've been invited to talk about. And so, being a very agreeable guy, that's what I'm going to talk about. But first of all, I'll mention a visit I made about 1.5 years ago that may, at first blush, seem utterly unrelated. A story you might think, oh, gee, he thinks he's talking at Georgetown, not George Washington. I got invited to speak at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, by the president of that university, a man who is famous for things other than being president of Baylor. His name's Kenneth Starr. Yes, that Kenneth Starr. And yes, I was and am a Clinton Democrat. But he had heard me speak when he was dean of the law school at Pepperdine, asked me to speak as part of his inaugural year, and to pick whatever topic I wanted to talk about. I don't know how many of you know Baylor. It is a Christian university, a faith-based university, very, very deeply and traditionally Baptist, Southern Baptist. It also is a research university. Those of you in medicine know the Baylor University School of Medicine, very famous school of medicine. But it's got strong programs in other fields as well, both in the professions, the sciences, and the humanities. What was my topic? My topic was the challenges and opportunities of liberal education at a Christian faith-based university. Leave it to a Jewish guy from California to raise that kind of. But notice, on the one hand, they are a faith-based institution. Faith is at the core of their identity. At the same time, they want to view themselves as a liberal education institution. Now, at the heart of liberal education is skepticism, is questioning, is treating what some people view as assertions and even as axioms as inherently problematic, as something that must be looked at non-dogmatically. We don't show a lot of respect for a professor of environmental engineering who publishes a paper in which the major finding is defended by saying, and I believe this deeply. Even though that may be, in fact, what lies behind his enthusiasm for the finding, and the tables are there to calm his readers. But the point here is that how do you bring together these sets of values? And part of my argument to them, and I won't give the Baylor speech today, was that properly understood, you really can be a faith-based institution and a research university and a liberal arts institution. But you have to be very reflective about it. You have to be very intentional. And you have to treat the essential tensions between faith and liberal learning consciously as a tension, as a potential contradiction that can be used as a springboard for deeper learning rather than as a great barrier to one or the other. Because, and now I speak as a psychologist, though a lapsed one, I'm sure, that in most of our lives, we deal with essential tensions between aspects of our roles, our personalities, our value systems that may not be faith and liberal learning, they may not be research or teaching. I mean, look at the enormous ferment that followed the publication by Anne-Marie Slaughter of her piece in The Atlantic about whether women can have it all. Remember that? And all of the ferment about, can you really be a nurturing, caring parent and have a high-speed career? And she said, no, you really can't. And people came back. You know, some of the most interesting and exciting banter on the web, if you will, in blogs and all kinds, were around this question of, are these tensions, is this tension irresolvable, or can it be seen as an opportunity in some ways to do both well? And one of my predecessors as president of the Carnegie Foundation was a man whose 100th birthday, where he's still alive, we celebrated a few days ago, last Saturday. And that was John W. Gardner, former president of Carnegie, former secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Lyndon Baines Johnson, founder of Common Cause and the independent sector. And when he came to meet the employees of Health, Education, and Welfare for the first time in the beginning of 1965, he uttered this now very famous line, "We confront a set of limitless opportunities masquerading as unsolvable problems." And that's the way I see this conundrum of research and teaching. It is not an unresolvable problem. That doesn't mean that it doesn't confront us with some damn tough issues. And we have to be prepared to deal with those issues. Which leads me now to tell a very different story of how that tension dominated my professional life for several years. In the early 1990s, I simultaneously chaired 2 all-university committees at Stanford. Now, let's face it, chairing one all-university committee is already a sign of psychopathology. Chairing 2 concurrently makes you committable without a hearing. But wait till you hear what the 2 committees were. On the one hand, I had been elected and served for 6 years as a member of what we call at Stanford the Advisory Board of the Academic Senate. The Advisory Board is the euphemism for the All-University Appointment, Promotion, and Tenure Committee. This is a group of 7 full professors elected by the faculty as a whole, though it must be composed of people from a cross-section of the university. And, you'll love this one, Steve, this committee reviews all appointments and promotions recommendations after the provost, not before. It's the last word before it goes to the president and the board. And the provost would have to meet with us after each of our meetings, where we explained which recommendations we were sending back for the provost to do a better job with, or the deans. And this is a faculty committee. The provost, when I served as vice chair and then chair of that committee, was Condoleezza Rice. She subsequently left for an easier job in Washington. But Steve, let that be a warning to you of what happens to provosts sometime. You know, Secretary of Energy. I mean, there's lots of dangerous places where my colleague Steve Chu is now sitting. Anyway, so on the one hand, I'm chairing the committee responsible for promotion, appointment, promotion, and tenure at Stanford University, which calls itself a research university for some reason. At the same time, I am chairing the Academic Senate Subcommittee for the evaluation and improvement of teaching at Stanford. So in one committee, I'm responsible for asking, how can we make teaching at this research university more responsibly and faithfully evaluated in terms of its quality? And given that the purpose of evaluation is improvement, how can we use those data to improve the quality of teaching at this university overall? And the next day, I'm sitting and reviewing faculty portfolios, and I'm confronting the fact that at our research university, research, publications, lists of publications, and most especially, letters from outside the university comparing Steve Lerman, candidate for full professor, with 6 other people at the same stage of their career in civil engineering or computational methods. And it's very hard to get the members of my committee to look at teaching records, to take teaching seriously. As an example, there was a professor of physics, assistant professor up for promotion to associate. And he had been teaching the Intro to Physics course. And there was a regular pattern in student evaluations of the course. The distribution of student evaluations was one of the most perfect examples of a bimodal distribution I've ever seen in my life. Half the students thought it was the greatest course they'd ever taken, and half essentially said, I didn't understand a word he said on day 1, and it got worse after that. What do you do with this? And like so many student evaluation forms, it wasn't terribly informative about what was going on. No one in his department had actually met with him about his teaching. We didn't have any record of people sitting in his class, for example, or reviewing the syllabus. And finally, well, one of my good friends on this committee, and I won't name names, was a Nobel laureate in economics. And he said, well, it's perfectly obvious what's going on here. Half these students shouldn't be taking physics. I said to him, do you know what it takes to get into this institution? And you're saying that half the students shouldn't be taking physics? This is crazy. But I also realized something, if you will, deeper. What was deeper was that as scholars, we do our scholarship by messing with evidence, whether the evidence is artifacts, letters, diaries, and archives, whether it's little squiggles on a screen that indicate what happens when certain fundamental atoms or something are smashing against one another, or whether, for someone like me, it's the thinking aloud protocols of physicians making difficult diagnoses and trying to understand how they think when they're making these diagnoses. And so we respond to data. We respond to evidence. And what would we have in the Promotion and Tenure Committee when we came to review Ken Bain for promotion? On the one hand, we had this huge pile of material on their research. Copies of their articles, which we did not always read. Well, we weren't all in the same field, you know, it gets a little hard. But the articles are peer-reviewed. Somebody else read them ostensibly. But perhaps the most important thing were 15 or 20 letters from people outside who were experts in the field and were asked to compare the candidate to other people. I still remember the shortest letter we ever got from somebody in mathematics who other people thought was the only peer to this person who was up for recruitment from someplace else. And the one line letter for those of us in the Bay Area was, "So-and-so is the Joe Montana of algebraic topology. Sincerely yours." Okay, how much more do you have to say? So we have this huge pile. And then what do we have about their teaching? I think the technical scientific term is bupkis. We have a small pile of summaries of student evaluation forms. And you know, the definition of a faculty member who has lasted a long time is someone who has learned not to take student evaluation seriously so as not to be depressed. Okay? Besides, how do you compare the weight you will give to student evaluations of someone's scholarship and teaching compared to those of peers through peer review? And I realized as I looked at those things that yes, it did say that teaching, research, and service are all valued at the university. And yes, research, especially for the initial tenure decision, does get somewhat more weight, but not by ignoring the other roles. And I think that my colleagues believed this. But it's, for those of you who do statistics, one way to think about this is the difference between something having a huge beta weight, but that which it weights is a very small, non-variable number. If everybody gets the same ratings, or if the ratings vary very little, it doesn't matter how much weight you give them, they end up not having much weight in the decision. Or my favorite is one I learned from a friend who's a mathematician. It's a story about the guy who loved soup. Whenever he went to a restaurant, he always ordered soup. And he's walking past one of his favorite restaurants, and in the window he sees the menu for today. Today only, this is the day all year, our chef's specialty, elephant and rabbit soup. Oh, this guy loved elephant and rabbit soup. So he goes in, he orders the biggest tureen they serve. They bring it to him, he starts eating it, calls the waiter over. He said, "This is very, very good soup. I mean, I love this soup. But it's not elephant and rabbit. I think it's the best elephant soup I've ever had. But there's no rabbit here." And the waiter said, "Do you want to talk to the chef?" He said, "Sure." Chef comes out. He tells the same thing to the chef. The chef said, "You're very mistaken. I only make this soup once a year. This is elephant and rabbit soup." He said, Are you serious?" "Yes." "But in what proportion?" He said, "Half and half. Half an elephant and half a rabbit." Well, the mathematician uses that story to remind students that a fraction does not have inherent value. It's a fraction of something. But it's also a way of accounting for my experience chairing the two committees. Yes, 50% of the weight can go to teaching. But if it's 50% of a rabbit compared to 50% of the elephant of the reviewed, documented, accumulated research record, then it's going to taste like elephant and rabbit soup. So that leads to the last piece of my talk, which is, so what do we do about it? What can we do if we want these two to be, if you will, elephant, think of something equally big, and dinosaur soup? I don't know. It's some hefty raptor. Maybe teaching is more like being a raptor. You kind of get out there. Or, you know, how else do you do it? Because I don't think you do it by admonition. We are scholars. That's why we're in universities, and that's especially why we're in a research university. A research university is committed to scholarship, to inquiry, to being an evidence-based community. Well, what does scholarship mean? Scholarship means that when we engage in acts of mind or creativity, we don't keep it to ourselves. That's not a scholar. A scholar is someone who engages in acts of mind, creative work, and goes public with it, and makes it visible. That's the first thing about scholarship. It must be visible. One of the saddest stories we all learned in high school biology was that Gregor Mendel's work in genetics was invisible for at least 30 years, and how sad that was. One of the commitments we make as scholars is to be public. And that's why the term publish is an important idea. It just means going public with what you learn, not keeping it to yourself. But that's only a piece of it. To do scholarship means to go public with our ideas and our activities and our messing with the world, so that it can be critically reviewed by the members of our community. Because just as Steve said, and thank you for that introduction because you've given me lots of material, you know? I mean, in doing the clergy study, I would have to draw from Leviticus. I get to draw from Lerner. We're not good at evaluating or assessing our own teaching. We're not always good at assessing or evaluating the quality of our own research either. We too can be enslaved by our intellectual enthusiasms. It's one of the purposes of peer review. Have you thought of this other way of looking at that? It's part of what liberal education is about. A liberal education, to a great extent, teaches people not only how to reason analytically, skeptically, thoroughly, persistently, but also to internalize the notion that there's almost always another way of looking at it. How else might it be understood? We're not very good at that at anything we do because we get so deeply, passionately engaged. And so not only must a piece of scholarship become visible, it must be looked at critically. And even that's not enough, because I could take something that I intend to keep secret, can give it to Diane, and say, what do you think of it, Diane? She gives me a really good critique, I make some changes, and then I put it away. Scholars don't do that. They make it visible, they have it critiqued, and they pass it on. They give it away. You can call it publication, but the fact is, if you don't want to publish it in a journal, these days you can simply put it on the web. You can give it away in all kinds of ways, but that's what a scholar does. Now let's look at teaching. If what I've just called scholarship is what we value in a research university, teaching typically is invisible, except to the students who have registered for the course, and even they may sleep through it. I mean, one of the things I always liked about some of my later years in teaching, where I taught some things pre-recorded online, is I felt it was a form of revenge, because finally I could be in a situation where I could be asleep while the students have to be awake listening to me teach. I mean, you know, it's a nice flip. One of my friends was giving a talk in Detroit at the synagogue of his brother, and he asked his brother, how many people are going to be listening to my talk? He said, oh, you'll probably fill the hall. He said, yeah, but how big is the hall? And his brother, the rabbi, said, oh, it sleeps 500. So, you know, our halls. In any event, the notion that we make these things public, why do we do that with research? We do it with research because there's something we understand about scholarship. The essence of scholarship is that we are members of an academic community. We talk about the community of scholars. I still remember the excitement I felt in Rockefeller Chapel when I received my PhD from George Beadle, Nobel laureate in biology and medicine. And when all of us had received our doctorates, he said, "Welcome to the community of scholars." And what I've come to understand over time is the reason we're a community of scholarship is because we are utterly interdependent. That's why we use footnotes and references. Because we couldn't do the work we do were it not for other people before us and along with us who are doing work in the same field. One of the things I've taught my students for years is that every footnote should be thought of as a thank you note to another scholar. Even if it's a footnote for a piece of work that you are critiquing because maybe the errors you saw in that piece were the catalyst you needed to do your work. And as your mother taught you, nice people write thank you notes. No. Why are plagiarism and fraud the two cardinal sins of the academy? It's because we not only rely on one another, we build on each other's scholarship. And if another scholar was fraudulent about her or his research, we're building our work on fragile, non-supportive foundations. But also, our work depends on our readiness freely to give our ideas to others. That's what we do when we publish or speak. And all we ask for is not a royalty, just a thank you. And the thank you is a footnote, a reference, having your name in the acknowledgement section of the book. Because the civility of this community means we acknowledge and thank others who we in turn expect to do the same for us. And what we put out there has been reviewed, and therefore reviewed after we've taken great care in developing it, therefore it can be trusted. That's my dream for teaching. One of the ways in which my work in the scholarship of teaching differed from that of my marvelous predecessor at Carnegie, Ernest Boyer, is that when Ernest Boyer wrote his book on Scholarship Reconsidered and argued that the scholarship of teaching had to be recognized as equally important with the scholarship of investigation, of integration or synthesis, and of service, which I agree with entirely. He, I thought, had a weak definition of scholarship. That's what happens when you become an administrator too early in life. Be careful. And that is that in a research university especially, we have to treat our teaching as a fundamental way in which we are messing with the world of our discipline and interdiscipline, which means that we have to treat our teaching as invention, as investigation, as creation that then gets enacted as instruction, and in the same manner, Steve, as you did with your computational methods class, and therefore both critically assessed to make sure that our enthusiasms were not running roughshod over the actual measurable quality of what we do, but also so that it becomes public and other people can build on it. Other people can go and look at our syllabi and look at the evidence of how well it worked. You had Carl Wyman speak here a year ago. I love Carl Wyman. He's a good friend. In fact, he so embodies this marriage of teaching and scholarship that when the Carnegie Foundation celebrated its 100th anniversary, its centennial, in a lovely event at the Library of Congress, and the connection between Andrew Carnegie and libraries, I'm sure, is one that you all recognize. I asked Carl to be the keynote speaker because he so embodied the scientist, scholar, educator. I was with Carl at Michigan State University. I returned to a place I had taught for 19 years with Carl, and he gave a talk about the teaching of science. It was probably a lot like the talk he gave you last year, talking about his experiments using clickers and things like this. Lovely stuff. Also talking about how assessment taught him the principle of more is less, or can be less, including less enthusiasm for the field itself among your students. And the first question he was asked was by another physicist who said, Professor Wyman, are we supposed to take what you say about teaching seriously just because you got a Nobel Prize? What's that got to do with teaching? And Carl's response was priceless. He said, my Nobel Prize adds nothing to my standing as someone talking about teaching science more effectively to undergraduates. What I have that you don't have with regard to the teaching of physics is data. You wouldn't for a moment presume to make statements about physics without data in public, but I notice that many of you are utterly unrestrained when it comes to making claims about the teaching of physics in public without data. That's why I am qualified to speak here, not because I have a Nobel Prize. And I suspect that's why you invited Carl to speak here a year ago. So what are some of the very practical things one can do? Not only to preach about this, but to, if you will, both raise the rabbit to the point where, even if it's not quite an elephant right away, it's at least a good-sized horse. And to deal with what is, in all of your minds, the underlying skeptical question. Okay, Lerman, Shulman, all the stuff you're saying is nice, but if I'm not going to get rewarded for this, if I'm not going to get a higher salary, if I'm not going to be promoted, if I'm not going to be recognized and treated with honor at the university for the scholarly work I do in teaching compared to what I do in my disciplinary and interdisciplinary research, all this is simply rhetoric. And I think that's a worthy question. It's a challenge for the provost and for the president and any others of you named Steve who happen to be in the audience and who, by virtue of the name given to you by your mom and dad, have power. The Lees and Larrys like me, forget about it. Now, I'll tell you one, for example. I don't know how many of you have ever won teaching awards. Sometimes the teaching awards even come with money. Sometimes it's pretty good money. $5,000 award. I don't know, what are your teaching awards worth here? Not 5,000? Okay, there are two problems then. One is, you ought to be ashamed of yourself if you're giving less money for a teaching award. The second is, there are a couple of universities in the country that have begun to develop an added practice. Faculty members who win awards for the scholarship of teaching that they do not only win a $5,000 reward, that $5,000 is permanently added to their base salary. Talk about a gift that keeps on giving. Feel free to applaud. No, I'm serious. That little move alone, can you imagine the attention it would draw to, I could do some really outstanding scholarly work on the teaching of biology and make it a piece of work that not only would attract attention here at the university, I can publish it on the web, and if I win one of those awards, it'll add $5,000 to my base salary. So it won't be like a one-night stand. Oh, God, did I have a great Saturday night? It is, okay, that's one. I mean, I used to make this argument when I used to hand out the Professor of the Year awards for the Carnegie Foundation at the National Press Club. And that was a $5,000 check associated with that. And I challenged the provosts and the presidents who attended to not just bask in the reflected glory of their faculty member winning, but to add that amount to their base salary. One place that's been doing that in the Scholarship of Teaching, I understand, is the University of Central Florida. Okay, public university, aspiring to be more of a research university, but it's a practice they've engaged in. What are some others? How do you create a culture of evidence around teaching? One of the things we always do in a university is we hire new people. Hiring. Now talk about an activity that has a set of rituals attached to it. And the central ritual, it's the equivalent of what in seminaries is your graduating sermon. You know, you give your senior sermon in seminary. Any MDivs sitting in the room who've given their senior sermons? I can't see anybody. There were when I talked at Georgetown. You can't tell because they're not wearing collars anymore, you know, that stuff. But we designed what we called the pedagogical job talk. And we wrote about it. And the whole idea was people come and give job talks. Everybody knows what a job talk is. In the mathematics department, the job talk begins where for the first 5 minutes, everybody in the math department understands what the job seeker is talking about. After about 15 minutes, there are 6 people who can still follow what she's saying. And if at the end of the hour, nobody can follow what she's saying, she obviously is smart enough to be hired. No, the fact is, job talks have a certain function. When you're talking about your research, they are very important. What I used to tell my doctoral students, don't spend 20 minutes talking about the statistical methodology, because there are only 2 people in the audience who are going to be interested in that. They want to know what your big ideas are. Okay. The pedagogical colloquium has one of several variations. One is we say to the candidate before they come in, we'd like you to choose an idea or a principle or of a topic that is in your field that is absolutely central to the thinking about the field. Maybe in evolutionary biology, it's the notion of adaptation. Maybe it's the notion of chance. I mean, you choose it. And then we want you to give a talk about what makes this idea central to your field, what makes it complicated or difficult for students to understand. Because Shulman's second law is, the more central an idea is to a field, the more work it has to do in the field, conceptually. And therefore, the higher the probability that students will misunderstand it when you teach about it. It's a variant on Zipf's law in linguistics that says the more frequently a word, especially a verb, is used in a language, the greater the likelihood that it's irregular in its conjugation. It turns out to be true for the most part. Well, I think it's true for ideas and disciplines and the structure of disciplines. So talk about why it's important, why it's hard to learn, and how you would go about teaching it. Or imagine that you've been asked to teach the introductory course in our discipline. And you have to give the introductory course in 10 weeks. How would you organize that introductory course? What would you most want to make sure was in it? What would you be prepared to leave out? And how would you organize it pedagogically so you would not fall prey to Lerman's nightmare of more is less? But talk about the teaching and learning of your discipline. Some places go on to have them give guest sessions, to give a guest lecture to their students, or to actually teach a seminar. Therefore, one of the things we found was that when the faculty started having their meetings to discuss the candidates, they would talk more about their pedagogical colloquium than they did about their job talk. Because by and large, the pedagogical colloquium had two characteristics that the job talk didn't. One, it gave a much, much clearer picture of the mind of the candidate as a member of the scholarly community for which you were about to offer them a job where they might be living with you for the next 40 years. And the second was, when they talked pedagogically, pretty much everybody on the faculty understood what they were talking about for the full 60 minutes. And therefore, everybody had something to contribute. They didn't all have to defer to the two people in the department who shared the subspecialty with the candidate. So now what does this mean? If pedagogical colloquia were not only a normal part of the hiring process of every candidate, but were announced publicly, people would come. Not only members of your faculty, but members of related faculties, because it would really be interesting. It would become part of the culture of the institution. Another thing that we've recommended is that the provost use part of his vast hidden budget. He just went like this. That's where the father-in-law of the bride gets the checks at the wedding, you know. And use it to fund at the department level or program level regular pedagogical seminars where faculty and students get together to discuss courses that are being invented, to get advice reciprocally about, okay, I'm going to flip this course, but how do I take the lecture piece and make it flippable? Make it worth talking about, instead of something for a recitation section where the TAs help the students prepare for the course exams. And why does it need a budget? Because never ask faculty and doctoral students to come to anything where you don't feed them. That's Shulman's first law. Food brings people together. Look, I grew up in my family's deli in Chicago, so I have to admit this is something that was internalized along with the pastrami that still blocks my veins. But it's taken seriously. If that pedagogical seminar occurs over lunch every 2 weeks, and there's good stuff to eat while it's there, and you have some of your senior faculty members talking about new ideas for courses, or about disturbing data that they've got about the course they've been teaching. When we studied the education of physicians, one meeting that was done in teaching hospitals that everybody attended was the clinical pathological conferences and the quality assurance conferences, because those began with problems. Here's a case I screwed up. How might it have gone otherwise? We've got a 35% infection rate in the intensive care unit. Here's some research from Hopkins on how to reduce that down to 0. What can we do to make that happen here at the University of California, San Francisco? That was actually one of the seminars that I sat on. And it was accompanied by lovely sandwiches. No, it matters, folks. It really matters. But the point is, that became part of the culture. It became part of, it was on everybody's calendar. It became part of what it meant to live the life of a faculty member at that university. What about evaluation? The report of my committee at Stanford on the evaluation and improvement of teaching argued that teaching would never be taken seriously at Stanford until it was peer-reviewed, because we take nothing seriously that is not peer-reviewed. The mistake that is made is that peer review of teaching at a university means that Steve goes and sits in my classes, any Steve will do, and I sit in Steve's. That's like saying that the way to do peer review of a bench science program of research is to come and observe them working in the lab. That's not what we do. Now, it might be important, especially if there are technical complexities, to see how they handle that. But the fact is, we review the proposals very, very carefully. How are they conceptualized? How is the program of work described as unfolding? How are they already prepared to measure and test the results that they claim they're going to get? Well, what about the syllabus as an artifact for the peer review of teaching? Want to know something? That if you knew that your syllabus was going to be reviewed with the same care as the proposals you write to the National Endowment of the Humanities or the National Science Foundation, your proposals would not look like the timetable for a railroad. If it's Tuesday, it must be Rousseau. They would have a narrative. They would have an argument. They would actually begin to approach academic papers. Students would have to take them seriously, and your colleagues would take them seriously. What about your plan for assessment? What kinds of instruments are you using? What data do you collect? When you are putting together your own dossier and you are presenting evidence about your courses, is there evidence about what the students learned, what they were able to do, what their attitudes were? When you posted all of this material on the web, how many hits did you get? Can we develop a culture of citation with regard to scholarship of teaching? So that someone can say, I built this course using heavily the course that Shulman and McLaughlin and Heath created at Stanford, the year-long course on qualitative research methods for doctoral students, for which the prerequisite was a year of statistical methods. We didn't want our qualitative course to be a city of refuge for the quantaphobic. But the point was, we didn't do that. And we should have, because we put so much energy, I and a policy scientist and an anthropologist, in this year-long course. The artifacts were incredible. The student work, the way we put together readings, ranging from scientific publications to detective stories, to illustrate how qualitative inquiry goes in the social sciences and education. It would have been so much more of a contribution. Even though it changed the lives of dozens and dozens of students who took it, it could have changed more lives. We could have messed with more of the world. I'll give one more example, because I've been going on too long. MOOCs. Everybody's talking about MOOCs. Monstrously overhyped online courses. Is that what it is? I couldn't talk, you know. I'm home to my, Coursera and Udacity. And you know, you got, it's going to be really important. This may be, to use the utterly overused term of art, disruptive. This is going to be a really disruptive innovation for some good reasons, but also for some very, very bad reasons. I'll just say a word about the bad reasons, and then I'll go on to the good reasons. The bad reasons are that it makes the mistake of thinking that an education is a concatenation of individual courses. It ain't. An education is a coordinated, intentional journey that a group of people takes together, where pieces build on other pieces, or challenge other pieces, or do both. It isn't, you know, any more than having a lovely marriage or other kind of relationship. I've been married 51 years. There's a difference between being in a relationship with someone over 51 years and watching yourselves and each other grow with a certain continuity and what have you, and having a relationship of 1 year long 51 times. No, there is. I mean, just think about these differences. That's the big danger of MOOCs. But what's the great virtue of MOOCs? In fact, it's the great virtue of technology. All these things that Steve called for, that I've been calling for, that the other Steve, that all the Steves have been calling for, about treating your pedagogy as an ongoing experiment, as something to be designed, experimented with, assessed, redesigned, retweaked, until you get it better and better and better, or decide to throw it out and start with something new. All of this, which we as faculty, remember, I'm a faculty member with 35 years of rings on my tree. The way to go is to go directly from being a professor to being a president. No stops in between. It's so much easier. Is resisted by us because we see it as holding us accountable. We see it as an intrusion in our academic freedom. Now, we don't see it as an intrusion in our academic freedom that we have to send our articles to be reviewed. Oh, no, that's the way we do it. That's the way and when we get really good feedback from the reviewers that helps us make the articles even better, it's thrilling. I love to do it as a reviewer. With online courses, we think of those questions as legitimate and automatic. Look, if my students have a choice of online learning of organic chemistry, the favorite course of all pre-meds, from 8 different sources, they've got to be able to see what the course looks like. They've got to be able to see how well students learn from those courses. There will be consumer reports, reviews of MOOCs in each field. How engaging, how good are the activities? Now, some may say, how easy to get an A? But you know what? The rest of us will read that too. And when they apply to graduate school and we see it's filled with those courses, they want to end up here. The point is, the beauty of the culture of online courses, even more traditional courses with all of their artifacts online, is that they become visible. Teaching becomes visible. It becomes critically evaluated, and it is passed on. It becomes a basis for the rest of us to do our work, to build upon. And in fact, if it's public, then it's much more likely that we will cite your course as a course that was a stimulus for me to develop my course. It'll be more like the way the business schools use published cases, which are published teaching materials. But now it's done with attribution. In the case of business schools, you often pay for them. They're seen by business school committees as acts of scholarship. And you get credit for promotion, you get credit for tenure. So I would simply conclude by saying, I do deeply understand the challenge of being both a research university and being a teaching university, and wanting and needing and being professionally obligated, responsible, morally obligated to do better and better with both. There will be blessed events where the two will actually come together. When I was a graduate student, the book that everybody had in their pockets or in their portfolio, it was like Mao's little book in China, was Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Remember? Those of you old enough to remember? Yeah. Kuhn, paradigms, paradigm breaking, all this was, okay. Tom Kuhn wrote a follow-up book called The Essential Tension. And he was asked many times, he said, where'd you get these ideas? He got them from teaching. Right after World War II, he was a teaching assistant in a course taught by James Conant, the president of Harvard, he was a chemist, who had run the Manhattan Project, or actually had run the branch of the science establishment that the Manhattan Project was in during World War II. And he was so dismayed that even the most well-educated people that he worked with in the policy world didn't understand how science was actually done. They were living with these myths. And so he created a course called On Understanding Science. Tom Kuhn was one of his TAs. And then Kuhn describes being asked to teach a course on Aristotle, much imbued with what he learned by TAing Conant's course. And he asked himself, how was it possible that Aristotle, arguably the smartest man ever to walk the planet, if you think about the number of fields in which he's still, from poetics to physics, and yet not realize something as easily observable, which is that falling bodies do not fall faster just because they're heavier. How could he have missed that? And he began thinking about paradigms, and it came out of creating his course. When he created his course and built it upon the course of Conant's that he had TA'd in, he found himself writing The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that came out in 1960 and changed all of our vocabularies, as well as the way many of us think about fields that weren't physics. I mean, the way we think about economics and politics and stuff like that. So there will be times when you will be blessed with that kind of, and you know what? Look for those opportunities. Steve talked about undergraduate research. Brian Coppola, professor of chemistry at the University of Michigan, a Carnegie Scholar, U.S. Professor of the Year. He designs his chemistry studies so that they can be done authentically and with integrity by undergraduates collaborating with him. He said, look, there's an infinite number of questions I can ask. I'm a university teacher. I deeply value undergraduate research. So I can ask, what are some really good studies that I can do that have certain characteristics, and he's defined the distinctive features, that make them really high fidelity opportunities for undergraduates to do research with me on. Well, he's vice chair of the Department of Chemistry. He's created an amazing postdoc in chemistry that's half research in the lab, half on the research on the teaching of chemistry, where he draws people who have been recruited by places like Harvard's chemistry department to come to Michigan instead. And Brian just won something called the Cherry Award that Baylor gives for teaching, which is worth $250,000, which is not being added to his base salary. And he isn't disappointed. So what I want to end with is simply an observation made upon the death of William Rainey Harper. William Rainey Harper was the first president of the University of Chicago. It's my alma mater. All my degrees are from the University of Chicago because I had to go to someplace I could get to by public transportation. And Chicago I could get to by public transportation. He died at the age of 49. He was a Bible scholar. And he was the person that John D. Rockefeller selected to be the founding president of the University of Chicago in 1893. After he died, there was an obituary written, a memorial essay, by Albion Small, who had founded the sociology department at Chicago. And Small wrote this about Harper's conception of a research university. Keep in mind that in 1893, the notion of a research university was an utterly novel idea. The Association of American Universities wasn't founded until 1906. Hopkins probably was the place that first started it in 1875. Chicago, Stanford, a number of other places built upon it. And Small said that Harper had a very capacious view of what a research university was. A research university had to be a place where the faculty and the students understood that everything in the world was susceptible to investigation. Nothing was off limits. even though they had a divinity school. It was a kind of divinity school where even matters of faith and divinity were not off limits to investigation. Certainly not the provenance of biblical texts. But, Small said, that did not stop by saying that at a research university, anything in the world around it should be open to investigation. If you really take that notion of a research university seriously, that it must include first and foremost the notion that the university itself is an ongoing experiment. The university itself is a site for experimentation, innovation, for messing with the world. And the university, therefore, should be a place that is always in the process of investigating its own work. For if it's not, then it cannot lay claim to being a true research university. So my challenge to you this morning is I share with you the ambition that George Washington University become an even greater research university. I think the world needs more and greater outstanding research universities. I think this is a place where doctoral students can be prepared in new ways so they leave here feeling that they have an obligation that shares research and teaching and doesn't pit them as opponents. But if you really want to have earned the designation of research university, then you have the obligation as teachers to subject what you do pedagogically, educationally, and structurally to the same culture of questioning, of investigation, of skepticism, and of evidence to which you submit all of your other work. And having heard Steve's admonition to you at the beginning of the morning, and hoping that all the Steves, and for the moment I'll hope all of you are Steves, you could do this sort of thing. And I'll be back in a couple of years to check up on you. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit of time for questions. This is being videoed, so use a microphone in the center of the room if you'd like.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can. Please announce yourself.
I will. My name is Alex Stagnaro-Green. I'm Senior Associate Dean for Education at the Medical School, and I'm a new faculty member here. I want to thank you for a provocative and a humorous talk, but most importantly, I want to thank you for addressing an issue which is at the heart of the tension that I deal with on a daily basis. And that is my primary charge, and the reason why I'm here at GW is to develop and implement a new curriculum for the medical school.
Ah, okay.
Dealing with the content and changing the content and convincing the faculty of that, I think that's easy. Dealing with the pedagogy and moving away from a lecture-driven curriculum to a more interactive is difficult, but I think it's eminently doable and logical and necessary. But convincing my faculty that their time and effort and energy and intellect is respected and will be rewarded is what I lose sleep over. And it goes back to the inherent tension that you started to talk about. And to me, it starts with the APT committee. And everything is driven from there, because when a person goes into a research endeavor in a research field, what they do on a daily basis is striving to accomplish what they need for promotion and for tenure. On the other hand, for what the educator does at this point, not incorporating the Shulman philosophy, is more to educate and bring those students forward and to challenge them and open their minds. But they're not expected nor required to add that scholarship. And I think until we do that, we are not going to elevate teaching to the level and to the quality that not only our students deserve and we expect from ourselves, but society expects of us. And to accomplish that, I think we have to change the paradigm a little bit and to take what you said and expand upon that. So for example, for those individuals in the medical school who are clinician educators or basic science educators, they need to have carved out time to do their scholarship. And that's not going to be NIH or NSF grant supported. And they need to have the mentorship to be able to move forward. And they have to have the expectations within the larger community. So I'm looking forward to what you talked about expanded dramatically, not only at our university, but around the country. So truly at one day, there's the Shulman elephant and rabbit soup that's not only half elephant and half rabbit by fraction, but in fact by weight. So I'd like to add to thank the Steves for all they've done to move things forward, and to thank the Lees for continuing us to push us.
Well, thank you. I'll simply make two comments. One is that during my years at Michigan State University, I was not only professor of educational psychology, but of medical education, because we started a brand new medical school at Michigan State. And because it was brand new with a new problem-oriented curriculum, even before McMaster, we saw it as an experiment. And part of my job was very interesting because I did some of the very best basic research I've ever done in my life doing psychological studies of medical thinking. Our book, Medical Problem Solving, was in print for 25 years. Harvard University Press, even. But what it meant was I was studying what has it meant for a physician to develop the expertise in diagnosis that is the goal, or one of the goals, of medical education. And so I was, on the one hand, doing basic research, but it was applied research, because it was helping to answer our question in designing the curriculum of what are we trying to create a curriculum to educate students to do. And I now know people who are historians, and part of their historical research portfolio is what does it mean to learn to think like a historian? What does it mean to think like a historian? And if learning to think like a historian is one of the goals of our teaching history, how can we design better pedagogies and better assessments so that we improve on that? And they publish this in history journals, and more of this is being published. The only other thing I'd mention is that for me, medicine is an interesting paradigm, because in their role as clinical faculty, physicians regularly engage in the scholarship of clinical practice through things like quality assurance seminars and through studies of the impact of their interventions on patients, and it would be considered immoral, unethical, not to do so. Well, our students and our impact on the students are the clinical subjects of all of us as faculty. So how can we not be asking those questions? But yes, I recognize that it's a challenge in the medical school, and I love the way you've articulated it. And may you have the same level of success as the Washington baseball team. That's tonight. And all I can say is I hope they win tonight. And I hope that when they play the Giants, but I'll go no further.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lee. I hope you'll tell your friends, not only here at GW, but at other institutions. This video will be on the web, and I think it would be worth viewing for those who are unlucky enough not to have been here this morning.
And thank you, Will.
We have lunches both downstairs and upstairs. The staff will be out there to direct you. Ken Bain, and I think I can say that it will be, and now for something completely different, Ken Bain will be here at 1:30, and we will reconvene then. Thanks very much.